Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson. I'm an attorney with the Lohman Abdo firm and correspondent for Western Wisconsin Journal and its predecessor, Power News. And if you have watched our previous segments, you know that I do legal and government and more things political, but we like to sprinkle in some public interest topics every once in a while. And today our topic is about organ and blood donation. And my guest to help me discuss this is Bill Cook. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I guess we'll start off with, first of all, we're having you as a guest because you have been an organ recipient. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And before we get to that story, because I think it's fascinating, I want you to tell me a little bit about yourself. I think I've known you for around 10 years, maybe a little more. But where did you come from, and tell us a little bit about your family and work life.
Well, I was born and raised in a small town in northern Wisconsin, actually the resort town of Tomahawk, Wisconsin. Paper mill and resorts were pretty much the industry. Town of 3,400 people, a high school graduating class of about 150 kids. So you knew everybody and everybody knew you. Very active lifestyle.
How'd you get over from Tomahawk to Hudson?
I actually was involved in sports throughout high school, track, wrestling, football until I got too small and was pretty much forced into cross-country running. But I wrestled the chancellor's son in the semifinals at the state tournament in Madison. And after I had beaten his son, he came down and offered me a scholarship to attend University of Wisconsin River Falls.
Okay.
Although it was only a one-year scholarship, it ended up being a great opportunity for me to get away from home in 3.5 hours.
So you were a college athlete, and I know now you're, obviously I know your wife probably even better because I'm in Rotary with her, and but you're married, kids and grandkids, so how did you guys meet?
Well, we dated all through high school, all through college, dated about 8 years. We were then married after we graduated from college. I believe she had some master's credits she was working on, so she had a couple of months left in school, and we started out in Menominee, moved to the Hudson area. That would have probably been in 79 or 80, probably 80, and I began working for the Ralston Purina Company in Minneapolis. We stayed in the Hudson area. She became a teacher, a home economics teacher with the name of Cook. She got a lot of laughs. But she was a very good teacher and taught up in the Somerset School District. I continued to work for Ralston Purina, and along came 3 kids in a succession of about 6 years. And they were all raised in the Hudson area, all attended the Hudson schools, and to this day are out working and raising children of their own. And all along we were involved in outdoor activities, sporting activities, exercise, biking, you name it, we did it, skiing.
I remember, I have a memory of the Pepperfest 10K, and you finished about 10 minutes ahead of me in that race. Speaking of races and your sports activities, I understand that you were a marathoner at one time?
Yes.
And you PR'd at New York, is that right?
I did. I ran several marathons, and it depends on the course. And a lot of times you do your training either to participate in a course, just because it's a famous course or a famous event, and Boston is one of those. But Boston isn't the type of course you try and run a personal record on. So New York City is, Chicago is. But I was fortunate enough to have the right timing and feeling good at the right day and not having injuries to be able to run in the 2:30s at the New York City Marathon.
Yeah, I think we have an image that will show our audience that it was like 2 hours, 36 minutes, something like that. That's still a pretty elite time.
In that range somewhere, and I actually had a goal set much quicker than that. I was trying to break 2:30, but a little more difficult than one might think to shave that kind of time off. But the way it ended, I was still happy with the time. So
I understand your son Jeremy's going to be attempting to break your PR here coming up in New York.
He's been working on it for at least a year, and he's much more prepared than I ever was, and as he is at many things, and I think he probably will here.
Well, so we go from a man who busy with career, kids, very active lifestyle, and then your health took a turn. And tell us a little bit, was it a dramatic, instantaneous change, or what did you start noticing?
I actually didn't notice anything, as I kind of wrapped up my competitive running almost a year or two before I started seeing symptoms. So I'd already started backing off the intensity of my training. So my wife and I would go out for jogs occasionally. But this one particular summer day, my son had mentioned to me he was going to try out for the soccer team at Northwestern, where he's attending college, and he had to run a 6-minute mile in order to make camp that year. That was something their coaches told him they better be prepared to do when they showed up for camp. So he asked me if I could train with him and run with him to a 6-minute mile, and I said, that's not a problem. I can run 26 miles at that speed, so should be able to just run a 3-4 mile race, or practice run. So we went out that day, and I could barely hold a 7-minute mile, much less even get to a 6. And it kind of surprised me because I'd been doing this for years and years and years, and to not be able to.
How old were you at that time?
Oh, probably 38, 39, somewhere in my late 30s, and I can't right now do the math. But
and
late
how
30s.
old are you now?
I'm 58, just had a birthday 2 weeks ago.
So this was your first experience of maybe chalk it up to just aging or whatever, but you were surprised that, and then what became more symptomatic then?
Well, at that time I had no chest pain, I had no shortness of breath other than knowing I should be able to run a 6-minute mile and I couldn't. So life went on for years. And then again with my son on vacation, a few years later we were running on vacation, and all of a sudden I started to really struggle and start to have tightened muscles, and I could tell oxygen wasn't getting spread to the muscle tissue the way it should have been to keep me limber and the muscles working properly to give me the kind of performance I needed. And I started noticing that, but it wasn't until I was jogging with my wife on a lunch hour, and my heart rate shot up to about 185, I believe, or almost 200 beats a minute, and
Wow.
it just didn't stop. It just stayed there when we stopped running for quite a few hours until I actually threw up the white flag and went to the emergency room and found out I
So
was.
when was this then? What year was that?
That would have been 2002.
Okay. Because I was trying to remember when that 10K was up in Pepperfest. It was probably in between.
Somewhere in the late 90s, probably.
Probably. And so early 2000s, you then have this, is that tachycardia? Is that what they call
Well,
it?
what I was in at that point was called ventricular tachycardia.
Okay.
And I was totally uneducated as to what can happen with the heart. As I'm far from an expert, but what I do know now is that there's two ways, well, there's probably many ways, but there's two main ways your heart can get in trouble. And one is lack of blood supply, and that's either due to diet or some other physiological reason where you get a block of blood supply to your heart muscle, and you actually have a heart attack where it means your heart muscles aren't getting the vital supply of blood that it needs. So
obviously
lose
the
tissue.
doctors could, you didn't need a doctor to tell you something was wrong at that
Right,
point.
I could sense something was wrong, but we weren't sure what it was.
And how long did it take for them to actually come up with the correct diagnosis?
It took almost 2 years. My original episode was tachycardia, and they weren't sure what was causing it. So it took an additional 2 years of testing and research by the Mayo Clinic. And I wasn't actually diagnosed even then. It was after my son's graduation party. I was trying to move tables and chairs, and I attended church soon after, and felt real dizzy, felt like I was dropping in an elevator, but I didn't pass out. But I knew I had to get to an emergency room, so I actually drove the car to the emergency room because we had a trailer hooked to it, all the tables and chairs from the graduation party, and my wife was trying to back it up in a parking lot. And so I actually drove to the emergency room in VTAC and stayed conscious for about another 20, 30 minutes, and they were going to put me out before they tried to shock me out of the VTAC, but I guess my blood pressure was too high or too low, I can't recall, but they did shock me while I was awake, and I don't ever choose to have that happen to me again. It was not a comfortable experience.
Well, was that the incident where the technician asked you, are you feeling okay?
No, that came later on. They
Okay.
prior to that, in going through my 2 years after I had my first VTAC episode, I had a physical down at the Mayo Clinic, and part of the physical is they run an EKG to see where your heart
Okay.
where your heart rhythm is at or where your heart rate is at, and it's a pretty specific test where they can see a lot of things. And they lay you down on an exam table, and they hook up leads, electrodes to you in the correct places, and then they run a strip of your heart rate. And in this particular case, it's a 5 to 10 second test, and then the biggest part is sitting down, getting hooked up, and they run the tape, and you're done within seconds. Well, it was almost a minute went by, and she hadn't reappeared, and then she reappeared and looked up over the little divider that was in her cubicle and asked me if I was feeling okay, and that's when I knew something something was probably up. And sure enough, I was in an arrhythmia at that point in time. I can't recall if it was VTach or not, but it looked like a child taking a crayon and scribbling on paper. It was so erratic you couldn't see any identifying.
So definitely abnormal EKG.
Right.
So you go through a process of kind of very slow change in symptoms. I mean, years separating between some of these incidents to then something definitely being known to be wrong, but not being able to find out. Finally, you get a diagnosis. What was that diagnosis?
Well, after my episode at the hospital where they had to shock me when I was still awake, they airlifted me down to the Mayo Clinic, and there happened to be a doctor on staff that particular afternoon on call, or it was his day to be in the ER that day, and he diagnosed me just from my chart. He saw my age, he saw my symptoms, and he diagnosed me with a disease called cardiac sarcoidosis, which at the time was very rare, and he told us at one time there had been 27 confirmed cases, a majority of them post-mortem. They were diagnosed after the person had passed away. So it was that obscure of a disease and unknown at the time, and it has to do with arrhythmia, and it has to do with this disease that they feel gets into a vital organ. Typically it's a pulmonary affliction. Somehow this
So it means
occurred to me.
airborne,
Right.
is probably.
And it's a fungal, they believe it's a fungal infection, but they're still unsure as to its derivation. Unfortunately, mine found its way to my heart, and it does
Just because
create-
yours was rare doesn't mean that there's other similar conditions in which cause decline in vital organs, in this case the heart.
Oh yes, there's
But
100 different reasons that you can.
Right, but
Go
this
into
is
heart
the one
failure.
that they ended up finding out was yours. So once they were able to get this diagnosis of cardiac sarcoidosis, they put you on a prescription and said you're going to be cured in a year, right?
No, it was. We were told that there wasn't a cure, which was disappointing, and that it would probably continue to worsen. Like I said, mostly it's a pulmonary disease, and it creates scar tissue, whether it gets in your lungs or your heart or whatever vital organ. It eventually renders it ineffective. So it all depends either how healthy you are, how resilient your body is to having this sarcoid slowly creep through your body and render it ineffective. And in my case, it was starting to scar the heart, the lining of the heart, and the worse that became, the more my rhythm was disturbed, and the more frequently it was disturbed, which meant I went into VTach more often. And over time, my heart continued to weaken with its output.
Now that's what I want to give for the audience's benefit on this time frame here, because we're talking about 20 years from you first notice any symptoms, and then you get the diagnosis around 2005. It's when the diagnosis is confirmed.
Right. Somewhere in that time frame.
And then being told that the prognosis is not good. I mean, there is no cure, and it's just going to be decline. It's a matter of how fast you decline. And
Correct.
as you said, this rare disease is something that most of the time they find out after the person has died. In your case, you're one of the rare people who find out while they're still alive. And the only cure being then a transplant at some point.
At some point, a transplant, they do put you on steroids. I was put on prednisone. They call it a wonder drug. It's used for a lot of things. And what it'll also do is reduce irritation. They also put me, after a while, staying on prednisone for a long period of time can affect you long term very negatively. It's a great short term fix, but if you're on it a very long period of time, it seems to have a lot of side effects. So they transitioned me over to a product called Cellcept. It's a mycophenolate chemistry. It's supposed to do the same thing that prednisone does. Prednisone is more of an anti-irritant, but it does many things. But this other material was actually, it suppressed your immune system. So what they were trying to do is make your immune system inattentive to the invasion of this sarcoid, and that then would create less scarring in less amount of time. So it'd give you a longer time frame.
Longer
of
time
survival.
frame. Now, again, with this being such a rare disease, they don't have a lot of record of people living with this condition very long. You actually, prior to transplant, we're going to get to that story, but we're talking about a 7-year period of time from confirmed diagnosis to transplant, 7, 8 years.
And it would have been 2004, and I was transplanted in 2013. So
Oh,
it was
9 years, all right.
9 years.
9 years. And I remember during that 9-year period seeing you at the Y, working out in the mornings, and over time your workouts just changed. I mean, you got the inability to do the same thing that you had done the prior year. You could notice that.
Oh, yes.
What was that like? What are you doing in that period of time to enhance your enjoyment of life while you see your health decline?
It was difficult, and probably the most difficult part was the mental anguish that one goes through as they're a very active person, very driven, very motivated to accomplish things, whether it's with family, with work, with fitness, whatever it might be. When you can't do that all of a sudden, everybody, well, at least you have your life, at least you can do other things. That's very true. So what I tried to do was stay as fit as I could with what I was able to do. So when I first was put on a lot of the medication, after they diagnosed me, they put me on such heavy levels of medication I couldn't run anymore, and I'd ran my whole life.
Right.
So I would try and walk. Well, the first day I remember trying to walk, and I walked to my neighbor's mailbox. That was, honest to goodness, how far I could walk. And I turned around and went home. And I told myself the next day I was going to go to the next mailbox, and the next mailbox, and the day after the next. So it took me almost 6 to 8 months, and I could walk for probably 1.5 miles, 2 miles. So what I did is I either forced my body to figure out how to continue to at least move and exercise and do whatever cardiovascular fitness I was capable of with the physiology that I was left with.
So this is after you're on medication. You then have to kind of basically retrain your body to get back. You're never going to be back at the same level you were, obviously, an elite athlete before. But you also take on a chore that 99% of men don't even attempt to, even if they're healthy, and that is you decided to buy a lot and build your own home after you get your diagnosis, right?
Well, I figured that, yes, that was something I could do on my own pace, on my own time. I actually had to resign from my job. I had been in sales with the company for almost 20-some years, and I was promoted to president of the company. And the company had recently been acquired by an East Coast concern. And of course, East Coast pace was a little bit above what I could handle at the time. So I stuck around for an additional year, and I had to resign my position, just couldn't keep up pace. So what I did is, I did just as you said, I bought a lot. And with my spare time, I'd work as much as I could. I actually kept my car running most of the day in the wintertime to keep shoes warm and gloves warm, so I could change them about every half an hour, because my feet would get too cold and my hands too cold.
Circulatory issues.
Right, because of my poor heart function. I was down to, at the worst, about 20% ejection fraction. Then I dropped to 15, and that means how much blood actually comes out of your heart with each heartbeat. So I was declining probably quarterly. Every time we'd go to Mayo, we'd get the new report card, which never was good news. It was always bad. So it was just keeping up the positive attitude.
So how long did it take you to build your house?
It took a lot longer than a builder would have taken. Probably it took 18 months, almost 2 years.
Still, you did it under 2 years, and you completed it. This, by the way, I should mention, this is not a little one-bedroom empty nest either. It's a good-sized house.
No, we decided to build the house we'd retire in one day, and not knowing where my health was going, we did a pretty major plan to have a main floor where I could access everything. And I must say I had some help. My son had graduated college at that point in time. The job market was lousy. I always wanted to teach my kids how to build and teach them a trade, and he learned how to hang doors, put on shingles, hang sheetrock.
And this is the same son that's a medical doctor?
Nope, he was still in med school, studying earnestly.
So you've got two sons and a daughter. All right.
Correct. Yep, this was my middle child, and he stuck me through the 20 below zero and finished the house in about 1.5 years.
Well, eventually the son that has the medical degree comes back into the story anyway.
He does.
All right, so let's fast forward then. You're going through this period of adjustment, recognizing that every quarter you're going to these quarterly visits to Mayo, you're losing. Eventually, though, knowing that you're going to be due for a transplant. I remember you talking about this years before it happened, that you were way down the list. And eventually, the process is called allocation, distributing the heart or organs to people who need them. And it's a regional process. You were going to have yours performed at Mayo, correct?
Yes, and I'm not sure how it works in other states, but at least in Minnesota, since I originally started my treatment at Mayo, they had all my records. They had a very good transplant record. They do a lot of transplants. I don't know the number. Someone told me at one time, even with all the new donors, there's 2,500 to 3,000 transplants done a year in the United States.
Just in that one? Oh, okay.
I believe in the United States. I think Mayo did between 45 and 60, somewhere in that the year before I was transplanted. And I'm not sure what the national number is, but it's
I've got some. There's an organdonor.gov if folks are curious. There's tons of statistics, and I was going to try and weave those in here, but sticking with the story. So you're on the list. You know that there's like 3 or 4 levels of priority.
Right.
And it took years to get to priority 1.
Right. You start on a level 2 list where there's thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people. And it sounds harsh, but I think what they pretty much try and do is give you a shelf life. They determine how seriously ill you are and how much time they feel you theoretically have left of life without a great deal of risk. And they have to do it that way because there's so many other people. There's children, there's a little bit older folks, there's middle-aged, there's 20-year-olds, there's every type of humanity that sits on that list, and they're all in dire need.
Yeah, as of 2013, it showed the statistics from that organdonor.gov show about 122,000 people that are waiting for an organ donation of some sort, and that there's about 29,000 operations going on. And of those, that's from 14,257 donors. So for every donor, there's about 2 organs that are, I guess, harvested. But I think that's a statistic that combines living and deceased. Because in some cases, people can actually donate a kidney, for instance, and still function fine on one kidney. In your case, with needing a heart, that person to donate it doesn't need it anymore. So
okay. What
happened on the day? It was on a Sunday, I understand. Is that
Right.
correct, when you got
Right.
the call? And just
Yeah.
tell that story. I think it's unique.
Well, we had just been at the Mayo Clinic 2 weeks prior to me getting this phone call, and I was number 10 at the list at the time and was told it'd be another year, which pretty much made sense, and I was in no hurry to be transplanted. You prepare yourself for it, but there is no way to prepare for it. You try and prepare yourself for it. And so I was expecting a year wait. At the time, I was on a 24-hour drip of milrinone. It's a drug that allows your heart to constrict a little bit and gets every last drop of blood shoved out of there with every heartbeat that it can. As bad as it was and as large as my heart became, that became the issue. I was just not getting enough blood out of my heart to keep my body alive. And what I would find is when I would strain myself, either with exercise or doing a chore, I would get lightheaded. My legs and hands and arms would go numb and get cold because most of the blood wasn't leaving the core of my body. It just wasn't enough.
Symptoms similar to what some people have when they have blockage of arteries and so forth.
So eventually you get so bad that they move you up the list to the level. So that particular morning, I'm sitting in my easy chair. I had been in church that morning. We usually attend 9 o'clock Mass, but we had a little 8-month-old grandson, I believe he was 8-month-old at the time, that was staying with us the night so his parents could have a night away from their 3 boys. And my grandson fell asleep about 7 in the morning, and we thought, well, we'll put him down for a nap then and wake him before church. But church time came, he was dead asleep, so I said, well, I'll volunteer to stay, because I wasn't feeling that well at the time then anyway. So I just sat there and was reading the Sunday paper, and it was about 9:15. My wife and daughter had left for church, and it was 9:15, and the phone rang, and I actually had the ringer off, which could play into a little later, but we had a storm come through 2 weeks previously, that knocked out our landline, so we had no phone. AT&T hadn't gotten around to fixing all the phones that were out, so I had no landline. And I would have been in church, but I chose to stay home to watch my son because he needed a nap. And I walk over and grab the phone, and it's a 507 area code, and I knew immediately, 9:15 in the morning, the only call it could be is the Mayo Clinic with a heart. And even though I knew I had a year to wait, and they have to ask your permission, they have to offer you the organ, and that's exactly what they did. They
offer it right there on that cell phone call.
So that's everything you've been waiting for, and think you're prepared for it, and it was no way I was prepared to even take that call. So I even hesitated to let it ring a few more times till I picked it up because I knew it was about to occur. And so they offered me the organ and said they were offering it to me because it was such a good match. They were going to bypass 9 people in front of me, and I believe 1 or 2 were hospitalized, which was even a farther priority ahead of me. That's how good a match that heart was. And the matches today are done so much more technically with data that they hadn't done in the past, and that's increased their survival rate right down to antibodies. And you take injections of certain immunizations that allow you to have a broader spectrum of antibodies, so you get better acceptance of the organ. So off to, I ran down in the basement, grabbed my grandson, looked around, thought maybe I should take something, but at Mayo you stay 90 days after transplant. So I took my cell phone and my wallet, walked out the house and headed to church, and my wife and daughter were in the back of church, and I parked the truck outside, leaving my grandson inside the truck. Figured he was safe in church, but my mind was elsewhere. And I ran into church and signaled with my to my wife and daughter, and my wife wasn't getting it, but I just pointed to my chest, and then I made a little cutting motion with my finger, and they got it. And they became very emotional. I was disturbing church by then because there was a lot of commotion in the back of the church, and we all left together. And I had some in-laws at church that I shared the news with before I left, so they spread the word so that Father knew why his Mass was interrupted. We drove back to my son's home. He's the doctor that you had told about. He's a dermatologist. He chose to drive me down to the clinic. My wife followed about a half an hour later. Normally an hour and a half drive. I think he had me there in about 55 minutes. And I was checked in wearing a gown, sitting in a hospital bed at 12:45 in the afternoon, waiting for the testing. And you go through a lot of screening prior to the actual
So
surgery.
the call comes at 9:15. By 12:45, you're in a gown, waiting to go through the procedures. But the operation actually doesn't start until almost 12 hours later?
No, it was a real mental test. It was that night at 7 o'clock is what surgery, and you're sitting there at the Mayo Clinic in the 5th or 6th floor, I believe it was, and the landing platform for the helicopters is right there. You can't miss it. When a helicopter takes off and lands, you just don't miss it. It's all day. That's all we saw was helicopters being reflected. I could see out my window into the glass.
You're wondering whether that's the helicopter carrying your
Is that my heart? Is that somebody else's heart? How come there's so many helicopters? Well, little did I know over the next 4 days there'd be 5 heart transplants. There'd be a double lung transplant and numerous other procedures.
Wow.
That helicopter was running organs back and forth constantly most of the day.
And so they're still testing you, even though they've said this is going to be, your pick to have the heart. It's not a done deal until they actually start opening up your chest.
If you, when they check you in the hospital, if you have an infection, if you have anything that they feel is going to put you at risk for going through this procedure, it'll be called off, and the next person on the list will be called. It's going to have to be something that's pretty important to put off a transplant because this is such a good match. And then they really don't approve the full transplant procedure until they actually receive the organ themselves from the donor, and that doesn't occur till just several hours before you're scheduled. So
And then there's actually a procedure where they tell you about the donor.
Well, in my case...
In this case, there was limited information.
Right. In my case, the final approval had to come with one more sign-off from me as I was being prepped. I was actually removed from my room, taken on a gurney up to the operating room. And I've never seen so much equipment piled into a room, and they had it all covered. They're a very professional organization, that's as the reputation portrays. But the doctor did come in about 5 to 7 before my procedure was going to start, and they said they needed one last consent, and that was that they had no time to do an autopsy on the cause of death of the donor. And they weren't sure. They just knew the person was unconscious, that his brain kept operating, but his body had shut down, and the organs were still kept healthy because he still had brain activity, and they had kept him alive to harvest the organs. And he was an organ donor, so they harvested from him lungs, heart, kidney, liver, about everything that was manageable, and affected a lot of lives that particular
So they give you enough information as far as perhaps as much as you can in order to make a decision. But in this case, the doctor said, they admitted that there was a little bit short. So
Right.
in this case, did you just go ahead and sign, or did you get some advice from your son?
No, I was in no position. I was had lines coming out of me already. They were about ready to put me under, and I was in no position to make that decision. So I told them my son was a doctor, was out in the waiting room with my family, and if they'd ask him, I had no issue with it, but I figured he was of sounder mind than I was, so I gave him the approval for the go-ahead. And obviously, he must have said yes, because
Right.
it went on, and 2 days later, I woke up.
So you wake up 2 days later. I suppose it's got to be a little painful.
It wasn't as it's an amazing procedure. I did wake up partially with some subconscious thoughts and visions from the next day, but nothing that I can recall of substance. And then I passed out again that I remember till the next day. And then at that point in time, you wake up and you realize what's been done to your body. And I had lines, probably 6 to 8 lines going into my neck, all into one main catheter. And then I had 2 lines coming out the bottom of my abdomen. I, of course, had the sutures for the open heart. I had 5 pacemakers over the 12 years of therapies that they...
Yeah, we never mentioned that. You had pacemakers installed prior to this transplant.
Right. And each year or two, I'd have to have a more and more powerful one to overcome the scarring and to keep the heart in rhythm correctly. And
Despite the fact
that.
you had tubes sticking out of you, and that would go on for weeks and then months, right? I mean, that
Well, what
you
would
were
happen
actually-
every, it's never easy. That it seems every 3 days they'd remove one tube. They wouldn't take them all out.
Right.
So over time, you would be able to eliminate all of them. But it took about 12 days
Okay.
to get everything out. And then, of course, the last couple lines came out just before you would depart. But as they became more comfortable with, what happens is when they harvest the heart from the donor, the heart is autonomous. It has no connection to the central nervous system. They sever all those ties. So when it's implanted into the recipient, there is no connection to the central nervous system, to your nervous system at all. The heart will or will not start beating on its own. Sometimes they have to help it along, and in my case, they did. It didn't start beating right away. They had to do some things to get it convinced that it was in the right place. And then for the next several days, probably next 7 to 10 days, they actually leave some wires. I call them doorbell wires because they're about the gauge of a doorbell wire, and they tie them up into neat little bows, and they're sticking out of your skin. And I really wondered what they were for, but after about the 3rd day, 4th day after you're disconnected from the support machine of ICU, that pacer actually tells your heart how to beat. It tunes it right into either if they want 60 beats a minute or 70 beats a minute. And you can get a heart from somebody who's a resting rate of 90 beats a minute. You can get a heart from someone that's got a resting beat of 52. That's what your heart rate's going to be, somewhere in that
Really?
range.
So that heart keeps the rhythm of what it was in the donor.
And that's all it knows.
All right. So in this case, you're recovering. Could you tell the difference between the old failing heart and the new one that was in you?
No, it was, you've got to remember too that I was born with some pretty good genetics. I couldn't have run a 2:36 marathon. You can train for a marathon your whole life and not run a 2:36 marathon.
I don't do fulls, but I do halves, and I couldn't imagine doing a half in half
So
that time.
there has to be some innate genetic, ability that you're born with, and when you remove that from someone's body, when you remove the core of their cardiovascular makeup, the expectation that you're going to ever get back to even close to that is probably unheard of, or not. I didn't expect it. I didn't know what to expect, and I knew that before transplant I was getting by, and I was at risk for heart failure, and it was getting worse. Even on the Milrinone, after a year of being on IV 24/7, I could start to feel even that was not doing the job. So my days were numbered, and I could tell. So I, with open arms, accepted the organ and accepted what was to come. And it was difficult at first because you actually feel worse, probably the trauma of the surgery, the heart's trying to beat, in a...
Well, and you were not an overweight guy to begin with. Obviously, a very fit runner. So your normal weight prior to surgery was what?
I was probably 165, almost 170, and post-transplant, I think I dropped almost 145 pounds.
I think we've got a picture of that, of you during the recovery process. Maybe we'll be able to show the viewers. But that was an instance of going through that acclimation process to the new heart, and you drop a lot of weight. Certainly your diet has to change. I think you got a story about that.
Oh yes, they train you, and again, preparing for it and then actually going through it are two different things. But when you're transplanted, you become immune suppressed, because what they want to do is suppress your immune system so that the chance of rejection is as least as possible. So what they do is they put you on heavy immune suppression initially, so you're in a very precarious state initially, and then as time goes on, it becomes less dangerous. So what you start out with is no fresh fruits, no fresh vegetables. What you think is healthy
Right.
can actually kill you because it's not been cooked, it's not been treated, it's been handled. And you don't know handled by whom and how long. Has it been stored at the proper temperature? So they put you through classes, no more cold cuts over the counter, no more ice in a restaurant, no more. And this is initially the first 3 to 6 months. And sometimes some of these things for life.
So how far are you from the transplant now?
I'm a year and 4 months, so it'd be July, August, September. So a year and 3 months
Okay.
out of
So
transplant.
July of 2013 was the surgery, and now
Right.
we're more than a year out. So what do they give you when they tell you, okay, after you've do this informed consent, get on the waiting list and want to go through this procedure, but once it's in you, and then rejection could happen at any time, is that right?
Yes, they do. It's not a pleasant procedure, and I had read about this previous to transplant. Once a week, they have to go in through your neck with a catheter, and they have to remove 5 samples of heart tissue from your new heart. And that's the only way that they can determine that a heart, I guess with other organs, there's other means like a blood test or something a little more simple than having an invasive procedure. So what they do is they find I believe it's called your carotid artery, that they go into and they drop down into your heart and they actually remove 5
Are you
samples.
conscious for this?
Yes, I chose to be conscious for the first 5 procedures, and after that it got a little more uncomfortable because it starts to scar where they enter every week, and it starts to become more painful. So I toughed it out the first few times just to not have to deal with the
How many times
sedation.
did you go through that?
Once a week, I believe, for the first 2 months, so that's 8 times, and then every other week for a month, and then maybe that was 2 months, too many to remember, too many times. You do become accustomed to
So they're
it,
taking 5 small chunks out of your heart each time they do this, and
Well,
they did this a couple dozen times.
and they don't get it every time. There was one time it took 11 tries. So it all depends, and there was a joke at the transplant house, all these transplant recipients talk to each other, and we had a ranking system, which doctor you would want to have and to do your
Okay.
biopsy, because some guys were 5 for 5 and some guys were 5 for 15. It took them 15 tries to get 5 samples in it. It's not the doctor's skill as much as it is they're sending down a little device on the end of a catheter into your heart, and they're just crossing their fingers they're going to get the right size
And they do this
sample.
for all different, not just hearts, but all
No,
organs.
it's just heart.
Oh, just
From
heart.
what I'm aware of, this
Okay.
is the only way they can determine, and what they actually do is count the number of white blood cells that are in that sample, and they can determine how many are trying to attack that organ because it doesn't belong there, or that they thinks it's an invasive something to your body. So the less you find there, the better.
So now, as far as what the doctors tell you for expected life expectancy, so to speak, I mean, not to sound crass or anything, but you spoke about this. I've heard you speak about this before. So
Right. Transplant is the last resort. I'm sure in the future there'll be other things. There's mechanical hearts that, if the transplant would suddenly go bad, they can at least put you back on an artificial heart for a certain period of time. But there is, I believe, still about a 5 to 7 year survival rate, and that's based on statistics. Everybody says, well, you're so healthy, you'll live forever. It all depends on a little bit of luck, on a little bit of how your body handles the immune suppressants. Does your body allow it to be tricked and fooled by the drugs that they're giving you, and everybody reacts to them differently. So I think what it is to live a good life, healthy life, eat right, don't be under stress, continue to exercise when you can. I believe it's got to help you with your survival rate. I don't know if that's always the case, but you like to think it is,
Sure.
versus living, maybe breaking some of the rules. They do give you rules to live by, and I think if you follow them, you can expect to hit that 5 to 7. I think you have to be pretty lucky to get beyond that. And
well, the fact that you lived with this condition after diagnosis for almost 9 years, again, going into it with the state of health you had versus somebody who I was just reading the other day where new obesity statistics came out for Wisconsin, 30%, and whereas 20 years ago it was only 11 or 12% of the population, so it's gone up like 2.5 times the number of obese people. So that had to be an advantage, being more in shape.
well, I think it has an advantage because I think your survival rate in a stressed environment is going to be better because your body's more fit, its circulation is better. I was able to be up and walking within 6 days of heart transplant, and I didn't walk for just 2 minutes. I walked for 30, 40 minutes, and I did that every day. I walked so much I think I hurt my feet because I wasn't wearing tennis shoes. I was just wearing
Okay.
the socks they give you in the hospital. So
And I know that we.
I believe that's important.
It's a much longer story with some great anecdotes that you've given, but I think that you've given our viewers, a good overview of what it's like and what leads up to. I mean, this is not a case of somebody who abused their body or didn't listen to doctor's advice, put themselves in a position where they needed a heart or anything like that. This was most probably an airborne illness that you happen to, which is extremely rare, and you just dealt with it. The flip side of this, though, I always like to look at the glass half full, is the fact that you are here to tell about it, and you're not the only person I know to have a major organ transplant in them and saving their life and extending it. But it's a rather simple procedure for people to become organ donors. Is that right?
It sure is. You can either register with the Organ Donation Society in your region or simply have it put on your driver's license. I believe there's some other registers too that you can sign up for. And I guess the one thing I want to make sure is to throw out a big thank you to the donor family that allowed me to receive this organ. we've learned who they are. I've learned who he is, and their family had a lot of sacrifice, and you can't help but feel for the family, although the doctors and everybody make sure that you don't have this guilt feeling. You have enough to deal with mentally going through the procedure and struggling with what you've gone through and what your family's gone through, that they try to keep that from laying on your shoulders, but you can't help but feel for the family that had lost a loved one to give up the organ.
Did you say he was 49?
He was in his late 40s.
Late 40s, yeah. So, and with kids, and they have lives too.
Day was going just like any other.
No one plans to become an organ donor, but yet it's needed. And we already indicated that the number of people waiting is 122,000. The statistics on organdonor.org, .gov, organdonor.gov indicate that there's roughly 120 million that are signed up to be donors. Now, one thing I learned, because after you agreed to do this interview, I wanted to verify, went online and actually found out I was not on the donor registry, even though I've had the orange dot for almost 20 years on my license. Apparently there might have been a change in the rules, but it's only for people who have gotten their license since 2010, and now we've gone to an 8-year cycle on licenses here in Wisconsin, so I actually was able to renew that. In addition to organ donation, which is, again, most simple to do when you renew your license. By the way, there's no age restriction, I understand. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I'm unsure of that. I think what it has to do with is if you can donate and they can harvest your organ and they look at it and they don't see an issue with transplanting that into somebody that's weeks away from death or months away from death. I'm not sure what their protocol is.
I should clarify, there is an age restriction. Minimum age is 15 and a half. You have to be at least 15 and a half and have a Wisconsin driver's license and state ID. But as far as an upper limit, there's people that think that they're too old or they're not in good enough health condition. Your organ health doesn't necessarily reflect your outside health, or vice versa, I should say. But anyway, if you can limit your donation too. I mean, there's people that limit it to corneas or whatever they feel comfortable with. But the blood donation side, I imagine that there's a few units of blood involved in a heart transplant.
Oh yes, and they do have like everything else, there had to be 5 or 10 sheets of paper I had to sign with the releases, and one of those included to receive blood if required, which it obviously was. And so far I've seen no ill effects from it, and everything seemed to go very well. And
so we'll hope for a much longer chapter on the happy ending there. And well, anyway, I appreciate being on, Bill, and thanks for telling. And we should also mention that besides organdonor.gov, there's a Wisconsin donor registry as well that's put up by the Department of Health Services. So folks can learn more information there. And thanks for telling your story. I appreciate it.
You bet. More information we can get out there to help people make that decision of organ donation, the better.
I guess before we sign off, though, and again end on a very happy note, I think we've got also an image that your wife forwarded to me. Picture of you on top of a mountain, is that right? Or
yes, we'd done nothing but talk about someday if I were to get a heart. And it was as recent as, a year and a half ago that we had no idea it would happen as quick as it did. We thought, first thing we'll do is go out west and see if we can climb a mountain trail. It was something I had attempted for the last 10 years and was unable to do. And we successfully climbed some of the trails in Mount Zion National Park, and it truly was...
That's in Utah?
Yes.
Mount Zion. I know it's a beautiful park, and it's a great picture of you. It must have been some sun there, I think. And it was great to be on top of the mountain, huh?
It sure was, and I was exhausted for days afterwards, but it made it all the more sweet.
I think we probably could put a whole show on, too, on the necessity of family support as well.
Caregiver and my wife through this whole procedure and through the 12 years, absolute saint to have the patience, because, of course, with the medication and all the procedures, I wasn't a pleasant person to be around at times, and she was a trooper. Yeah. Held up very strong, and to people everywhere, don't just congratulate the recipient or the person that's ill. Behind them or next to them or alongside them is a caregiver that needs just as much support. I had a lot of doctors caring for me. I had a lot of nurses watching out for me. What my wife didn't have was the doctors and the nurses. What the caregiver needs is support from family and friends, and even though they don't ask for it, they need it.
Well, I appreciate, always good to end on that attitude of gratitude. in this case, both for the donor and their family and for your own family. So thank you, Bill.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. Be sure to make sure that you are an organ donor, and if you also have the correct health history for it, encourage you to become a blood donor as well. Thank you for joining us again on Western Wisconsin Journal.